14. Deuteronomy chapter 14. We've got, let me see if this is working because it was giving me some trouble in the first service. Okay, seems to be working right now, so hopefully it keeps working. Deuteronomy chapter 14 is broken up into two main divisions, okay? Two main divisions. Verses 1 through 21 is treasure. We'll see why that is in just a moment. And then verses 22 to 29, tithing, treasure and tithing. In case you are unaware of what's taking place in Deuteronomy, Moses is preparing the people to go into the promised land. And so he's not going with them. So he's given them some last minute instructions and really reminders of what they need to do when they get into the promised land. And so these things they've actually heard before. It may have been people that were older than them. They heard this back in Leviticus and Numbers and heard these laws, and he's given them. Deuteronomy means second law, or the second the retelling of it, the second time they've heard it. So he's telling them again things that he's already talked to them about. And some of these things he is expounding on and giving more info. And so we'll see some of that today. So let's go ahead and look at our first section here in Deuteronomy 14. This is just not working again. Can somebody back there give me a hand? There we are. Verses 1 through 21, we're going to see the treasure, and we'll find out why in verse 2. But let's pick it up in verse 1. You are the children of the Lord your God. Okay? So he establishes that at the very beginning. You're God's children, he says. This group that he's talking to, you're God's people. He says, you shall not cut yourselves, nor shave the front of your head for the dead. So what he's talking to them about here in verses 1 and 2 is mourning. Verses 1 and 2, mourning. Okay? He goes on to say in verse 2, tells them why. Why they're not to cut themselves or shave the front of their head. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Now, he begins here by telling them something that sounds very odd to us. We go, wait, why would he tell them not to cut themselves? I mean, that's a good thing not to do, not to cut yourself. But then he also goes on to say, you shall not cut yourselves nor shave the front of your head for the dead. And what he's talking about is doing that specifically for the dead, or to honor the dead. But cutting themselves and shaving the front of their head was a form of humiliation, really. You get a little sample of this. It's not the same setting. But there's the story about Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Anybody ever heard that story before? Incredible story where they're having this sort of competition. But in the process of the prophets of Baal calling on their God, they get so worked up into a frenzy that they actually begin to cut themselves to try and get the attention of their God to answer their prayer. And it's quite an incredible story. If you get a chance to read it, you should read that. But he tells them here not to do it for the dead. So don't do these things for the dead. Now, what is it exactly that they would do? Again, they would cut themselves or shave the front of their head, humiliating themselves. It was a form of humiliation, self-humiliation. And they would do these things in order to honor the dead, in order to get the attention of their God, obviously. Okay? But he tells them why they're not to do this in verse 2. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. Now he started out in verse 1 by telling them you are the children of the Lord your God. Now he tells them you're not to do this or mourn this way. Was it okay for them to mourn? Yes, it was okay for them to mourn the dead. It's not, we don't have to try and hide our feelings when somebody that we love dies, but how we go about that, God is concerned with. And here in verse 2, you are a holy people to the Lord your God. Holy meaning sanctified. You've been set apart for God's use. Okay? Now, here's what's going on. They are going into the land of Canaan. In the land of Canaan, there is idolatry taking place there. We've talked about this quite a bit as we've gone through Deuteronomy. And in the land of Canaan, there were people there, families, dads, wives, husbands, moms, all of them living there. But when they were involved in their idolatry, what came along with that idolatry was very, very sinful. I mean, besides it being idolatry, the practices that they were engaged in as part of that idolatry was very, very sinful, very dishonoring to the Lord. And so God is trying to get them to understand or have the mindset, you are the children of God, you are holy people to the Lord. In other words, you're different, you're separate, you're set apart for God's use. Now, he tells them in verse 1 that they are not to do these things, not to cut themselves, not to shave their head. I am in just a moment, I'm prepping you. Because in just a moment, I'm going to show you a picture. It's quite a gruesome picture. By gruesome, there's not any blood in there, but there is an individual with something stuck through the side of his mouth, through his cheek. Okay, so if you're kind of like, you know what, I don't like that kind of stuff. This is not some Halloween ploy or something like that. I'm going to explain to you what it is after I show you the picture. But if you don't like that kind of stuff, then I would suggest that you just look down at your Bible when we put the picture up. And that way, you don't, that's not, some of us have trouble, images get stuck in our minds. And we hang on to those. And you might be trying to go to bed tonight and you're like staring at the ceiling going, oh, I can't forget that picture. Probably most of you are going, I can't wait to see the picture. But also, don't, if you're not supposed to be looking at gory stuff or whatever, don't look at it and then go tell your parents on me. Like, you know what he showed us? Because, then I'll get phone calls and emails again. Okay? All right, so we're going to show the picture. So if you just want to look down at your Bible for a moment, you can do that. I don't know if this is working. There it is. Okay? So he's literally got a tricycle handle going through his cheek. 9 Emperor Gods Festival. Okay? Let me just go ahead and click through here. Okay, we're going to leave it there. So you're safe. You can look again. Let me read to you what exactly is going on in that picture. Masong. The guy is considered a Masong at the Thai Vegetarian Festival, also known as the 9 Emperor Gods Festival in Phuket, Thailand. The festival is a 9-day celebration that occurs on the eve of the 9th month of the Chinese lunar calendar. The festival is celebrated throughout Thailand by people both with and without Chinese ancestry, with the largest celebrations taking place in Phuket. In accordance with the traditions, many religious mediums, we've read about mediums in our Old Testament study as we've been going through. What is a medium? A medium is someone that is a medium or a bridge between the spirit world and the physical world. Okay? Now, Jesus was obviously, there was one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. So we know that Jesus was the bridge between God and us. Okay? This is not the same thing. This is done in an evil way. This would end up, if you were to investigate, this would end up being people who are communicating so-called with the dead, but what it is in reality is they are communicating with demons. Okay? Listen to the description. In accordance with the traditions, many religious mediums will conduct ritualized mutilation, that's what that was, while under a trance-like state. The purpose of this practice is a mixture of veneration for their gods and ancestors. What did we just read? Do not cut yourself or shave the front of your head for the dead, for your ancestors. Okay? Veneration of their gods and ancestors to display their devotion to their beliefs and the trance itself, which has a profound impact upon demeanor for days or weeks after. frequently with devotees. That's what he was considered. He was devoted, a devotee, appearing exceptionally calm and focused in their day-to-day activities after the festival is completed. According to an early 19th century interpretation of Chinese Taoism by a local community of Chinese immigrant miners, the 9 emperor gods, okay, the name of that festival is 9 emperor gods. What is the deal with these 9 emperor gods? The 9 emperor gods, according to tradition, listen, this is what happens. The 9 emperor gods descend from poles located in the shrine's yards and incarnate. That means they put on flesh, incarnate, okay? And incarnate by using the bodies of the participants, the picture that we just saw, as shells for walking on earth. So supposedly these 9 emperor gods descend from these poles that are inside the shrine's yard area, and they come and they go into the people that are there waiting for them, and they take over the people's bodies and live out, walk on the earth through these people. Okay? Now, I probably a lot of you are following, you understand, but in case you do not understand, we would consider that to be demonic possession. Okay? It's not 9 emperor gods, it's not, there are no other gods, there's one God. Okay? And so these so-called 9 emperor gods we would consider to be demons coming and possessing these people and causing them to do those kinds of things to themselves. And that picture that I showed you was the least gruesome of the pictures that I have. There were other men with other objects, and it is quite terrible. It goes on to say the participants who prepare to volunteer their bodies to the gods are called the Masong. During the main rituals at the temples, the Masong fall into a trance and pierce their cheeks with ritual objects, including knives, spears, relics, and other items of personal significance. I saw some with handguns through their cheeks. Saw one picture of a man with crescent wrenches, 2 of them, through his one cheek. Quite horrific. And obviously the picture that we saw there was just disturbing. Rules for the festival: cleanliness of bodies during the festival, clean kitchen utensils, and to use them separately from others who do not join the festival. That's good. Don't pull that spoon out of your cheek and then try to serve some food with it. No good. Wear white during the festival. Behave physically and mentally. No meat eating, no sex, no alcoholic drinks. People in mourning should not attend the festival. Pregnant ladies should not watch any ritual. Ladies that are experiencing their time of the month, should not attend the ritual at all. So all these different rules that they are concerned with. But this is modern time. This still goes on. We're not talking about Deuteronomy 14 here. We're not talking about some ancient ritual that doesn't happen anymore. This is modern world. Modern world. Still happens every year. And so the things that you and I are studying through in Deuteronomy are what God is telling the people here is quite significant. We need to make sure that we're not looking at this as something that's just archaic and it's just ancient and it's an ancient writing and there's really nothing here for us. No, these things that God is telling his people obviously applied to them back then and absolutely apply to us also. That's not how we conduct ourselves we ought not to conduct ourselves like that, period. All of us would go, yeah, I don't have a problem with that. I'm not planning on putting a tricycle through my cheek. But also, that's not how we worship. That is not how we worship. That's not how we conduct ourselves. And so the things that God is telling these people in ancient, as they're getting ready to go into ancient Canaan, are still applicable for today. You and I need to understand that we today, as he says in verse 1, are the children of the Lord your God through our faith in Jesus. Verse 2, You are holy people to the Lord your God. Do not engage in those things because you are holy or sanctified or set apart. And there are times where God will make it expressly clear in his word that we ought not to engage in some activity. And oftentimes you and I can find ourselves going, well, you know what? I mean, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that God knows that that's step one. But step one leads to step two. Step two leads to step three, or leads to other steps. And before you know it, you find yourself engaged in things that you never thought that you would be wrapped up in. And so here they're being taught even how to mourn. Now verse 2 says, before we leave this section, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Now, I cannot leave this verse without mentioning what is happening. I hope that you know what is currently happening in Israel. Yesterday, Israel found themselves, they suffered an attack by Hamas, which is a terrorist group. This is, from initial reports, some people are saying that this is the worst attack in the history of Israel. Others are saying that it's the worst attack since 1973. And warfare has been going on with Israel and Hamas and other groups forever. And I don't want to just chalk this up as, well, that's just another one. You know, here we go again. The pictures and the videos that are coming out of this conflict are horrific. I would caution you as far as if you're trying to find out information, which I think is a good thing, find out information about this conflict and this war, and I'll tell you why. Because this is going to be in your social media news feed for a little while. And I would venture to say from times past, what you are going to see in your social media news feed is you are going to see that there's going to be some siding with Hamas, and well, this is justified, and you know, Israel shouldn't have done this, and I get it, people should not be attacking people back and forth and all of that, but you and I need to understand something as we watch this unfold. And that is verse 1. You are the children of the Lord your God. That's what God said to the Jews, to the Israelites, what we call the Israelis today. Verse 2, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God. They are his people. And in verse 2, he says a special treasure. That's where that title came from. A special treasure above all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that God loves the Jews more than he loves anybody else? Well, we know that God loves everybody, right? John 3:16, we're all familiar with that. For God so loved the world. So we get that. We understand that. But the fact is, the truth is, you and I cannot deny it because we've been told from time to time as we've been studying the Bible, and that is that the Jews certainly receive special attention from God. There's no doubt about that. They're his special treasure. He makes that clear. Now, why is that? Look what it says in verse 2. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. But we are not told why. Now, some of you may have been around a few chapters back, and we found out why. We found out that God loves people because God loves people. You go, well, that doesn't make any sense to me. Join the club. I don't understand it either. What I do understand is that God is love. What I do understand is that God is omniscient, is omnipotent. What I do understand is that God created us, and what I understand that because of that, based on that, the fact that God created us, he can do whatever he wants. And if he decides that the Jews are going to be his special treasure, then that's what he decides. Now, I say all of that before leaving these first couple of verses. Here's why. Because in this conflict that's going on, it's not good to kill people. War is not a good thing. Sometimes it's justified, but it doesn't mean it's a good thing. But you and I need to understand that the war ultimately, the conflict that's going on, the war that's going on, ultimately, it's over land. And there's a group of people who say, hey, you shouldn't have kicked us out. And, we were here first. And that I get all of that. I understand, man. Somebody else moves in and you're booted out. I mean, I would not be happy about that. But the fact remains, you and I have been through it, that God gave the land to the Israelites. I didn't decide that. Moses didn't decide that. God decided that. The people didn't just choose it. The people wanted to stay in Egypt. God said, no, I'm taking you to this land. And so it was God who put them in that land that was considered Canaan back then and Israel now. But there have always been disputes about that. But you and I need to understand that as we are hearing the news and we're praying, because we need to be praying about the conflict. And we need to not only be praying, we don't need to just be praying that, oh yeah, that, God, I know you're with Israel, and I just pray that you would help Israel to just kill everybody. We need to understand that there are people on both sides of this conflict that do not know Jesus. And they are going to be killed, and having not known Jesus, they will go to hell. That's what the Bible teaches. So we need to understand that and be praying yeah, Lord, that you would settle the conflict, but also that you would save people. People that are going to be losing their lives over the next several days, maybe weeks, maybe months, who knows? So God here tells them in verses 1 and 2 how to mourn. Can I get some help back there? Because there it is. I don't know if I did that or you guys did. Now, here's the next thing. Let's go ahead and put it up there. Verses 3 through 21 has to do with meat. And the fact that they were his special treasure, they had a specific diet that they needed to follow. And really, it wasn't necessarily specific, but they needed to stay away from certain animals. For instance, God told them not to eat eagles. Now, you and I, because we're in America, we understand eagles are protected, man. We wouldn't eat them anyways. I mean, we don't do that. We eat other birds, chickens and turkeys or whatever, but we don't eat eagles. You're not allowed to do that anyways. But there's a sense here. God is, what happens here, Moses, as he's giving them this list in verses 3 through 21, he gives them animals that they can eat and animals that they cannot eat. Okay? And there's a reason for that. And one of the reasons, I believe because there are a lot of Bible teachers that are way better than me that believe this also, that a big reason for this was health. It wasn't just, no, you're not allowed to do that, not allowed to do that because I don't like the way the eagle looks. It was more for health, because a lot of these animals you will find eat other animals. Eagles, there are other birds that are, yes, they're hunters, but they also are scavengers. They also will eat dead things. And then for you to go and eat those dead things means, you see what I'm saying? It's like, that might not be so clean. And God wanted his people to be different. They're a special treasure. He wanted them to even eat differently. I grew up, obviously, in a Hispanic home, Hispanic culture. And some of you that are Hispanic, man, you probably know this. Man, we eat everything. Everything. You can go into a so-called Mexican market. Some of you have gone into those. And you can find all sorts of things in there. You walk up and it's like, what is that on the counter? And there'll be a big tub with some watery stuff in there. And there are pickled pig's feet in there. People will buy those. I've got an uncle. He always used to buy those. And you can buy them, you just chew on them. Chew off all the meat. Yeah, it sounds disgusting, huh? And you'll go in there and you'll find a container usually on top of the counter with this, like, what is that? It's fried kind of like, what is that? It's fried pigskin, chicharron. Excellent in a tortilla with a little bit of salsa. Okay, crunchy. But you can find all sorts of other things in there. It was not uncommon for us growing up. At times, my dad would be up early on a Saturday or Sunday morning. The rest of the family was still asleep. I'd be awake early, and he would leave, and he would go over to a place called Cuatro Milpas, or he'd go to another place. He would come back and have a bag. I knew what was in the bag. It was a special treat. He would come back with this bag, unwrap it, steam coming out, and there would be a cabeza in there. A cabeza means a head. And there it is. There's a picture. Is that yours? So that's what it is. So we would, and that one's got the eyeballs missing already. So we would eat that. He would buy that, and he would buy a package of corn tortillas. And then he and I would sit there. You pick meat off of it, put it in a tortilla, roll it up, and eat it. You eat, whatever's in there, the eyeballs, the brains, whatever's in there, tongue, all of it. You can still, I don't know, I'm assuming you live in Southern California, so you know this, but you might not know this. You can go to a Mexican restaurant, and you can get tacos or burritos de lengua, yes, beef tongue. Yes. Or you can get, again, cabeza. You can get burritos with brain in it or whatever. We eat chorizo, and chorizo, they'll tell you, oh, chorizo, that's just the intestines or whatever ground up into like this hamburger meat looking thing. But they throw everything in there. Whatever they're not using, so they got lips, they got whatever, they just throw whatever the animal, if it's pork chorizo, they make beef chorizo also, but they just throw everything in there. And, I grew up eating all that stuff. And then years later, for some reason, my doctor told me I had high cholesterol. What a surprise, eating all that. Point being this, that just because you can doesn't mean you should. Just because you can eat some of these animals doesn't mean you should. So God is giving them a list, and again, it's Moses, but this is handed down from God. Things that they could eat, things that they were not supposed to eat. Okay, we're not going to read through that list. But let's go down to verse 22 where we look at tithing, an important part of the Jewish life back then and certainly an important part for us. And it says in verse 22, you shall truly tithe all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year. So whatever they were growing, the grain that they were growing, they needed to take the first portion of that and give that to the Lord. And you shall eat before the Lord your God in the place where he chooses to make his name abide. What is he telling them here? He's saying, listen, you're going to take your grain. And there were different kinds of offerings that they would give to the Lord. But they would take this grain, they would take it over to the tabernacle, they would dedicate it to the Lord. It would get cooked, and then they could actually eat it, partake of it. And that was part of their sacrifice. He's saying, but when you do that, you need to do that in the place that the Lord has chosen, in the tabernacle, the one spot, the one place for sacrificing to the Lord. Don't do that in your home. He didn't want them to do it in their home and then start coming up with their own things. You know how that goes, right? They just kind of like, oh, yeah, we don't need to. During COVID, I explained this, I think, a week or two ago. We were getting together on Instagram Live on Wednesday nights. And one Wednesday night, we broke up into small groups and we were on, we weren't on Instagram. What was that other thing that everybody was doing where you would have like online meetings and stuff? What? Zoom, right? Everybody's doing Zoom? Zoom, that's what it's called, yeah, Zoom. And we were on Zoom. I remember we were having communion through Zoom. It's like, we're going to do the best that we can here. And some of the guys, how the guys are. It's like, hey, we're having communion. I had been announcing it. Oh, that's right. Oh, yeah, give me a minute. I'll be right back, And you had guys going, and they come back and say, oh, all I could find was a soda and, this half a hot dog or whatever. It's like, but that's what happens. Everybody's off doing their own thing. They just start coming up with their own plan. God says, no, if you're going to do this is what I want you to do. And you're going to come to one central place. We're going to do it right. Verse 24, he gives them some instructions as it concerns the problem of distance. Because God had one central place for that sacrifice. But God also understood. There were people back then that were, what we call lame. I don't mean in a bad way, like today we'd go, oh, that's so lame. I mean, like people whose bodies maybe were paralyzed. They were not able to use certain parts of their body. And they couldn't just hop up on the back of a donkey and travel 50 miles to go to the tabernacle. God understood that. And he says that there's a problem of distance. He says, listen, then he makes a way for them to be able to sacrifice. Verse 24, but if the journey is too long for you, so that you are not able to carry the tithe, or if the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far from you, imagine an old a man or lady. And, maybe they're very old and weak and they're just not able to travel that far. Or maybe somebody's really poor and they do not have the money. He'll talk about providing for the needy, but maybe they do not have the money to travel that far. It takes money. But he goes on to say in verse 24, or if the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far from you when the Lord your God has blessed you, then you shall exchange it for money. Take the money in your hand and go to the place which the Lord your God chooses. So maybe there's just this problem of distance and taking an animal with you and or the grain and all those different things. He says that what you can do is wherever you're at, you can exchange that for money. He says then bring the money with you to the place where that God has where he's set up his tabernacle, and then you can use that money to buy things there that you can offer to the Lord. And this is where years later we find the priests in trouble, because pilgrims were coming into Israel from faraway places, and they would come with money just like this, and they would say, hey, we need to buy a sheep to sacrifice or some doves to sacrifice. And oftentimes they were getting ripped off in the temple. The priests were charging exuberant rates and saying, oh, well, these are top of the line, animals, and we got to charge you the most. And remember Jesus coming into the temple and flipping over tables, and he had made a whip out of, he had made his own whip and was chasing people out. You guys remember that scene? I remember that scene, one of my favorites. That was why, because there was so much corruption even in the temple because of things like this. Now he goes on to say in verses 27 through 29, he tells them, you got to provide for the needy. You shall not forsake the Levite who is within your gates, for he has no part nor inheritance with you. The Levite, those were temple servants in the temple. And God had told them, I'm not giving you anything as far as an inheritance, land. I'm not giving you those things. He told the Levites, instead, what I'm going to give you is myself, God said. Pretty incredible. You're going to have a special relationship with me, but in exchange for that, you won't have a lot of earthly goods. So the people needed to make sure that they were taking care of the needy, and that even meant the Levites. At the end of every third year, you shall bring out of the tithe of your produce of that year and store it up within your gates. And the Levite, because he has no portion nor inheritance with you, and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who are within your gates may come and eat and be satisfied. I'll get to the last part in just a second. But understand that God is saying you need to make sure that you're thinking about the needy, right? Because it's easy to just be like, hey man, I'm doing my own thing, and you know what? I'm not thinking about anybody else. He says you need to stop and think about the needy. There are strangers who want to participate also, and you need to help them and help them along as they're doing this. And the fatherless and the widow, make sure that you're taking care of them. It was God's welfare system. Make sure that you're taking care of those people. Now notice what he says in verse 29 at the very end. That the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. He's saying, do these things that I'm telling you to do so that I can bless you. I want to bless you. We see the desire of God there. We see the kindness, the thoughtfulness of God, and making sure that the poor and the needy are taken care of. But also what we see there in verse 29 is that God wants to bless his people. And this is conditional. What he wants for them to do is for them to be obedient to him. Do what I'm telling you to do so that I can bless you. See how that works? Do what I'm telling you to do because I really want to bless you. And sadly, as I've said before, many of us know they actually did not do what God wanted them to do. Let's move on to chapter 15. Let me show you how that's broken down. Verses 1 through 11 are the Lord's release. We'll find out what that's all about in just a minute. Liberating servants in verses 12 through 18 and then the law of the firstborn animals, verses 19 through 23. But let's look at the first section, the Lord's release, in verses 1 through 11, where what God tells them here in verses 1 through 11 is to completely forgive debts. And this is all based on the 7th year, or 7-year period. Okay? Look at verse 1. At the end of every 7 years, okay? So if it goes 6 years, at the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release of debts. And this is the form of the release. So he tells them what he means. Verse 2. Here's the form. Every creditor, okay, who has lent anything to his neighbor shall release it. So anybody, if you lent money, then you're a creditor. You gave credit. And he says at this point, every creditor who has lent anything to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not require it of his neighbor or his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. There it is. See how original I am in my titles? It is called the Lord's release. And what God is telling him is, at the end of every 7 years, you're to forgive this. It's called the Sabbath year. Every 7 years, you need to forgive debt. Now imagine that. What a thought. Now there are different things that are going on here. In other words, God is doing several different things. And we'll see some of them here. But one of the things that God is doing is He's allowing people to be released from their debt freely. Okay, every 7 years, so that way you're not constantly under debt and just living a life that's being suffocated by being under debt. But there's something else going on. Let's read here, verse 3, of a foreigner, you may require it. So he says, if you lent money to somebody that's not an Israelite, you can still require payment from them. This applies from Israelite to Israelite. Of a foreigner, you may require it, but you shall give up your claim to what is owed by your brother. So give it up. Now listen, before we go any further, let's talk about some modern day real life application for just a moment. Let's take this and apply it to your situation. Uh-oh, somebody got a text. Imagine your brother or your sister, your sibling, borrows money from you. And then God tells you, hey, let it go. But. That would be hard to do, wouldn't it? Isn't it hard to just let that money go? It's like, wait, you want me to just forget about the money? And God is saying, yeah, I want you just to let it go. What? What are we talking about here? Why would we do this? Well, God is trying to teach His people. We'll see this develop. God is trying to teach His people how to be generous. How to be generous. Tell that guy to be quiet. Tell him, hey, be quiet. Yeah. God is trying to teach His people how to be generous. And so He's telling the creditors, hey, 7 years, let it go. You go, what? Nah, I don't like that. Now, you'll like it. You'll like it by the time we get to the end of the chapter. You'll like it. But here He's trying to teach them, be generous. Let it go. Verse 4, except when there may be no poor among you. That's a little indicator for you and I. What God was doing was He was actually trying to prevent people from being poor all of their lives. He was trying to help the poor. That's one of the things that He was doing there. He says, except when there may be no poor among you. For the Lord will... Now listen, verses 4 and 5, I'm going to read it together. Except when there may be no poor among you, for the Lord will greatly bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess as an inheritance, only if you carefully obey the voice of the Lord your God to observe with care all these commandments which I command you today. So what God told them in verse 4 is there's a possibility of there being no poor people in your country. And you go, man, that sounds pretty incredible, right? However, that was based on, verse 4, their obedience or disobedience to what God was saying. If they obeyed God and did what he told them to do, there wouldn't be any poor people in the land. However, if they do not do, which we all know they did not do, then there were going to be poor. Now, verse 6 says, "For the Lord your God will bless you. Just as he promised you, you shall lend to many nations," so they have an abundance of money, "but you shall not borrow. You wouldn't have any need of money. You shall reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over you." Now that's based on if the people obey God. Now, beginning in verses 7 through 11, he tells them to care for the poor. This is the other thing that he was teaching them through this forgiving of debt. I love this section, verse 7. "If there is among you a poor man of your brethren, within any of the gates in your land, which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor shut your hand from your poor brother." Let me simplify it for you. Don't be stingy. Don't be stingy. And don't be stingy with your brother or your sister who wants to borrow something. I've even seen people, man, I know none of you would do this. I know none of you would do this. But I've even seen students tell their parents, "You owe me $10. Remember that $10 you borrowed from me 2 weeks ago to put gas in the car, to take me to the mall? You owe me."
I did have a problem for a long time.
Guilty of that. Yeah, but not anymore, right?
No.
No way, man. No way.
No, because
No way.
it was whenever my brothers would go to winter camp or summer camp.
Yes.
Because I didn't go, Mom would just like say she owes me $20.
She'd pay you for not going to camp.
Yep.
Wow.
Because she was supposed to pay me supply for camp, but because I didn't go, she would just.
Okay. But yeah, I've seen people do that. Like, "Oh man, hey, Mom, Dad, no, I ain't got $5. You still owe me $10 from the last time you borrowed money." And what God is saying is, nah, hey, let go. Be generous. Care for the poor, even if the poor is your dad. Sometimes you got the cash right there, like out trying to buy something. Like, "Oh man, I got any cash? I got nothing." Strange, the strangest thing. I rarely have cash. I use my card a lot, or Apple Pay now, right? Beep. It's the strangest thing though. When I have cash, man, I can hide that so deep in my pocket, man. My family knows it's there. They're like, "Hey, you got $5?" I'm looking at them like, "How did you know?" I was hiding that. Like, "How did you know?" But I don't know. They smell it or something. I don't know. How do you guys do? You guys probably do the same thing to your parents. Like, "Hey, you got $5? Can you please buy me this or whatever?" And your parents try to like, "Oh, I don't have any cash." "No, yes you do. It's in your right pocket. It's way down there. And you're like, "Oh, okay." But what God is saying is, hey, be generous. Don't harden your heart nor shut your hand from your poor brother. Look at this in verse 8. "But you shall open your hand wide to him and willingly lend him sufficient for his need, whatever he needs." Let me give you a biblical principle here before we move any further. As far as giving money to people, verse 8. We have an opportunity and oftentimes the responsibility to help someone with their needs. Not their greeds. Their needs, not their greeds. In beautiful San Bernardino, we have lots of homeless. And people there, you get out at the store, they're going to hit you up for, "Hey, you got any cash?" You get out at the gas station, "Hey, you got a little bit of cash?" You are getting off the freeway, somebody there with a sign. Anything helps, asking for cash. Here's the deal. What I like to do is I like to stop and say, "Well, you need money?" "Uh-huh." "What do you need it for?" Because see, if they have a need, that's an opportunity for me to meet that need to some degree. If you need a home, well, man, I don't have a home to give you. Sorry about that, but Is there some other way that I can help you? Now, here's what I've had happen before. I've had people say, I've said, well, what do you need the money for? Well, I'm hungry. Okay, that's not a problem. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to buy you a burger or a burrito or whatever. What do you want in it? Okay, yeah, okay. You want Coke? Yeah. You want fries? Okay, yeah, okay. Go get the food, bring it back, bless the individual. But I've also had people say to me, hey, could you spare any money? Well, what do you need the money for? Well, I just need to get something to eat. I'm really hungry. And then I go, oh, well, I'll get you something to eat, man. I'll go right here to Jack in the Box and I'll get you something to eat. I've had them tell me, oh, never mind, no thanks. Why? Because what they wanted money to buy whatever they wanted. Oftentimes alcohol, sometimes it's drugs, sometimes it's both. I have no responsibility to meet someone's greeds. That's not my responsibility. What I do have a responsibility to do is to meet someone's needs if I can help in some way. And sometimes I don't have it. Sometimes, at the gas station, a lot of times I'm using my card like, hey, you got any change you can spare? Sorry, I don't. I got a card, man. I got nothing. I got no cash. I don't have, but even in those instances, maybe it's, well, what are you trying to get? If you just want a snack or something, gas station hot dog. But I'd try it twice. It's like, if I can go in there and get you something, bless you with something, but oftentimes they want it for their greeds, not their needs. So just let that help guide you. You're not required to just give out your money every time somebody asks. Just because somebody's obviously poor doesn't mean that I have to give them some money. What do you need it for? I always like to stop and ask. It's funny, my kids are older now. My youngest is 22. It was funny that when my kids were younger, how generous they were. Somebody would approach us and say, hey, you got any change? And they would say, Dad, come on, can we give them some money? And I would stop and talk to the individual. Well, what do you need, whatever. But it's funny how generous my kids were with my money. And then I noticed that when my kids got jobs, man, they were stingy. It's like, what happened? That guy asked us for money. Why didn't you give him some of your money? Well, oh, when it was my money, you were ready to give it away for free. When it's going to cost you something, now all of a sudden, like, I can't, I got to provide for somebody's needs, not their greeds, Dad. That's what you taught us or whatever. And it's like, oh, okay, I get it. But what God is generally telling them here, Moses, speaking through Moses, and he's telling them, be generous. Be open-handed. Didn't you love that in verse 5? But you shall open your hand wide to him, willingly lend him sufficient for his need. Verse 9, beware lest there be a wicked thought in your heart, saying the seventh year, the year of release is at hand, and your eye be evil against your poor brother, and give him nothing, and he cry out to the Lord against you, and it becomes sin among you. See, some people would go, oh, I can't lend you money because next year is the seventh year, and you don't have to pay it back, so I'm not going to lend it to you. Stingy, greedy. God said, don't do that. You do that, he's going to cry out to me, and then I'm going to hold that sin against you. Verse 10, you shall surely give to him, and your heart should not be grieved when you give it to him, right? Because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your works and in all which you put your hand. Like when your brother comes to ask you, hey, you have $10 I can borrow? And you're like, we just studied through Deuteronomy 15. I'm supposed to be generous. Fine. And you go, unlock your piggy bank or whatever, and you get, $10 out, and you crumble it up, and you give it to them all in pennies, because I don't really want to give it to you, but here, take all my $10 worth of pennies, all mad about it. No, bless them. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to hook them up. Verse 11. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, he was just telling them, don't go. Oh, well, the Sabbath year is coming up. You won't have to pay it back. Nah, I'm not lending you. He says, give it. Give it freely. Where does it come from? It comes from the Lord. The Lord puts it in your hand, just give it away. Easy. That's what they call, that's easy money. Go ahead. The Lord gave it to me. I'm just giving you what God gave me. Verse 11, for the poor will never cease from the land. Wait a minute, I thought there weren't going to be any poor. Well, that's only if they obeyed. and they were not going to obey. So they were going to be poor. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall open your hand wide to your brother, to your poor and needy in your land. And then beginning at verse 12, we have the liberating of the servants. And he tells them here in verse 12, number one, you want to set them free. Verse 12, set them free. 7th year. And then in the 7th year, you shall let them go free. And then in verses 13, 14, and 15, I love this. Supply them liberally. And when you send him away free from you, you shall not let him go away empty-handed. Wait, I'm letting my servant go, and I have to give them stuff. Verse 14, you shall supply him liberally. See that? Be a liberal when it comes to giving things away, blessing people. You shall supply him liberally from your flock, from your threshing floor, and from your winepress. Supply him. From what the Lord your God has blessed you with, you shall give to him. See, when I look at my things as things that belong to me, I earn these things from, blood, sweat, and tears, babysitting those little brats, I earn this money. This doesn't belong to anybody. Then it's hard to let that go. I grip it tight, like Ebenezer Scrooge, man. But when I go, hey, the Lord blessed me with the ability to mow a lawn or to babysit or to take someone's trash cans out, and you earn a little bit of money from that. The Lord gave you the ability to do that. So he's putting the money in your hand. There you go. Give it away. Verse 15, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you this thing today. So be generous. Remember what it was that God did for you. And then finally, servants by choice. In this section, servants by choice. This is deals with people who in the 7th year they were being released from their servanthood, and they go, hey, master, I really like you. I want to keep on. I want to be your servant for the rest of my life. That was allowed. And what he tells them in there, he goes, what you're going to do is, you're going to take that individual, man or woman, you take them to the doorpost, okay? The doorpost is what the door's hanging on, okay? And you take them there, you put their ear against the wood, you take a pointy object called an awl, A-W-L, and I've got one at home. It's just kind of small like this, real pointy, and it's made so you can hit it with a hammer on the end, and it pokes a hole in whatever you're poking a hole in. And he says, take the individual, put their ear against there, poke a hole through it, and put a ring in it. Yeah, ear piercing. And then by that, that would be an indicator. You ever heard of the phrase or the word earmark? Like it's earmarked for something, it's set apart. Well, that's already earmarked, to go to, this other country or whatever. That's where it came from. You would put that in there to indicate that you were a bondservant, or you had chosen to stay someone's servant for the rest of your life. You love them, you like working for them, and I want to stay, and you could do that. But you had to have a ring in your ear. Incredible, huh? For the guys, don't go home and tell your parents I said it was okay to pierce your ears. Okay? It's not what he's saying. Okay? That was for a specific purpose. And so that he's given them instructions there. Verse 18, it shall not seem hard to you when you send him away free from you, for he has been worth a double hired servant in serving you 6 years. Then the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. And finally, and we'll go through this very quickly here. In fact, I'm just going to put both of these up. That's how that last section is broken down. Verses 19 and 20 has to do with sanctified animals. Verses 21, 22, and 23 have to do with animals that had a serious defect. The sanctified animals were animals. It's the law of the firstborn is these are animals that would be dedicated to the Lord and dedicated through sacrifice. So you would take the firstborn from your sheep or your goats or your cattle, and you would give that to the Lord. Now, not many of us understand this. Some of you might still be farmers. You understand that for your cow to birth a calf, that's a huge deal. And you try to protect that calf with, to the best of your ability. I mean, if even if you don't have cows, you've probably seen Dr. Pole. And you know that farmers, man, that's their investment. And so you would then be responsible for taking that animal and dedicating it to the Lord in a sacrifice. Oh, this is a big deal. He says, that's what you need to do. He said, don't worry. I know I'm taking your first animals. I'll give you more, but I want your first. I want to see your dedication. The serious defect part has to do with animals that were the firstborn, but they came out with some sort of defect. One of their legs is lame and not working, or whatever. It had to be, and he does mention a serious defect in verse 21, as if it's lame or blind or has any serious defect. Here's why he had to say that. Because some people would have their first calf, and maybe it's a beautiful brown calf. But then, oh, there's a little white spot on it. I guess we can't give it to the Lord. It has a defect. That's not what he meant. Okay? He meant if it has a serious defect, the animal is not in proper working order. What he tells them in verses 21, 22, and 23, he says, don't give those to the Lord. He says, those you can actually eat on your own if you want, but don't give those to the Lord. We want to bring those without blemish to the Lord. Now, does anybody know, as we finish up, why we want to give animals, or why they were required to sacrifice animals without blemish? Anybody know? Anybody got any wild ideas, crazy ideas? What do you think?
To cleanse them from their sin.
To what?
Cleanse them from their sin.
Okay, so to cleanse them from their sin, yes, they had to. It was required that those animals would not have any blemishes, as Hope said. Anybody else? Why was it so important that the animals not have a blemish? I mean, if they're just going to sacrifice them, what's the big deal? Joaquin, what do you think?
Because if they're blind or deformed, that's like showing that they're not like perfect animals. And so by sacrificing a non-perfect animal, it's kind of offensive against God.
Because what?
Because it's like if you like sacrifice like an imperfect animal, then that's kind of offensive against God.
Okay, so you want to give them your best, right? You want to give them your best.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Okay. Here's the ultimate reason. God was conditioning his people for what? To be on the lookout for the perfect, spotless lamb. Who was that? Jesus. Right? Mind blown. So God, even back in Deuteronomy 15, was conditioning his people to be on the lookout for Messiah, the perfect, spotless lamb, the sacrificial lamb. So that's why that was going on. And what does the Bible tell us? The Bible tells us that Jesus, being that perfect, spotless lamb, lived a sinless life, died on a cross when he was about 33 years old. And what did he do? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever would believe in him should not perish but have everlasting life. 17, what does it say? For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. God offered his Son. How did he offer him? Freely. Remember the debt section that we just went through? Forgive the debt. And we go, man, I don't like that. I told you, you'll love it. Here's why. Because God gave his Son freely, and Jesus came down and offered himself freely to pay for that debt, to wipe the debt out. What an incredible picture. Deuteronomy 15. Listen, if you have not surrendered your heart to God through Jesus, then that means you're still carrying all that debt, all of that sin. The spotless, perfect lamb has already been offered. Now it's a matter of you by faith going, you know what? No, I need to have my sins forgiven. I need God. I need Jesus to forgive me of my sins. His death was enough. I need to be freed from that. And you can walk out of here without that debt. Forgiven. Just like he was talking about in the Sabbath year. Forgiven. Freely. Wiped out. Done. Boom. Just like that. That's what the Bible teaches. Father, thank you so much for today.